Hi everyone. So I will be discussing conservation of ash forest using parasitoids as biocontrol of the emerald ash borer, which has become somewhat infamous by now. And I chose this system for a couple of reasons. One being that I found it a good example of how insect ecology can be applied for a conservation issue. We often hear about biocontrol in the context of agriculture, but in this case, while ash trees are definitely important economically, they also have high ecological value. And so if we can get this problem under control, we can protect a lot of species at the same time. And the second reason being that I found this system to be provide good examples of several of the concepts that are central to understanding parasite ecology and parasitoid ecology, and we will look at those in more detail. So I'll be reviewing a little bit about the ash borer, how it's spread, and the damage that it's caused to ash forest. I'll look at the biocontrol program that's been implemented to date, and then the two papers. The first looks at an important aspect of parasitoid behavior, which is host seeking, and in this case, possible evidence of using larval vibrations. The second paper looking at the concept of specialization among parasitoids and niche partitioning, and how two of the parasitoids are dividing up the resource. And then we'll draw some overall conclusions for the larger field of conservation biocontrol. So the emerald ash borer is Agrylus planipennis, and it was first detected in 2002 in Michigan and Ontario. And a quarantine of firewood was attempted but did not work, and infested firewood ended up being a major vector of the ash borer. As of May of this year, it's been detected in 33 states and 3 Canadian provinces. And we're talking in just a 16-year time frame. So very incredibly rapid spread. And it's the larvae that are the problem. They tunnel extensive galleries in the phloem and xylem, and as you can imagine, this is quite disruptive to nutrient flow. These galleries and the D-shaped exit holes of the adults as they emerge are the main signs that a tree has been attacked by the ash borer. So ash borer has killed hundreds of millions of ash trees, and again, that's in just 16 years. And the 6 species of ash that we have here in North America are now listed as critically endangered. Once a forest is invaded, significant mortality occurs within 5 to 7 years. And it was found that in some of the Michigan forests where the outbreak began, 99% of the once healthy overstory trees ended up perishing. And this is a problem because ash trees provide food and habitat for a great number of organisms. And in some of the earliest areas to be invaded, we are already seeing impacts on other invertebrates associated with ash trees, as well as other native plants and nutrient cycling in those forests. So there are some native parasitoids that will act on the ash borer, but they have not been effective so far at controlling the ash borer alone. And so USDA began a biocontrol program in 2007. They imported exotic wasps that are native to the ash borer's native range, which is in China and Russia. And then they subjected those to extensive testing to see whether they would attack hosts other than the ash borer. And it was found that they are not likely to do so, at least in the short term. So there are 4 main species that are the focus of this program. Obius agryli is an egg parasitoid, and then 3 larval parasitoids. Tetrasticus planipennici is an endoparasitoid, and 2 ectoparasitoids, Spathius agryli and Spathius galeni. And Spatheus agrile failed to establish, probably because it's too far north of its endemic range, and so Spatheus galeni has only recently begun to be introduced, and it is for releases at latitudes above 40 degrees north. So it's expected to have better climate matching than agrile. So Obius has been a slow spreader. It causes a low amount of parasitism at study sites. Tetrasticus has been quite successful so far with a rapid spread. And you can see in the graph at upper right, it's causing parasitism in 20% or 20% parasitism in young ash trees, up to 80% in saplings. And this is happening not just at release sites, but at control sites where it was not released. So that indicates that it is dispersing. At the same time, the ash borer attack on surviving trees in Michigan is now just at 10% of the peak that was recorded in 2009. And we're also seeing that in areas where Tetrasticus is having a protective effect on ash trees, native plants are being favored over invasives, and the forest is beginning to regenerate. In the meantime, Spatheus galeni, again, that's the most recent one to be introduced, that is predicted to take over protection of mid-sized ash trees, and we'll be talking about that in a little more detail. So the first paper explored a concept that is important to understanding parasites, and that is how they detect and seek out their hosts. And in the case of Tetrasticus, it's been demonstrated that it prefers larger hosts. It allocates more eggs and more females to larger hosts. The ash borer larvae are concealed under the bark, and when parasitoids attack concealed hosts, they don't have visual cues to detect them, so they have to rely on things like feces size or chemical cues. And Tetrasticus, it's been shown, won't parasitize ash borer larvae if they're inactive. And so it's been hypothesized that they're using vibrations from feeding or moving to detect the host. They may also be using those vibrations to assess the host quality, that is, the host size. And previous studies have found that later instars of the ash borer produce more vibrational energy. So the authors were looking at 3 hypotheses: that brood size and female progeny of Tetrasticus increase as the larvae increase their weight, that the amplitude or rate of the larval vibrations increase as the larvae increase their weight, and that Tetrasticus progeny data and the ash borer vibration data would be significantly correlated, meaning the larger ash borers are producing greater vibrations and giving a cue to Tetrasticus to lay its eggs there and to lay more eggs there. So the study had 2 parts. They took some measurements of larval vibrations with an accelerometer, recorded a short clip for each larva, and then calculated the mean vibrational rate and amplitude. And then in the second part, they exposed the larvae to Tetrasticus females, allowed some time, and then counted the larvae that had been parasitized, which would look like what you see in the photo here. And then allowed some time for the Tetrasticus adults to emerge, counted those, and calculated a sex ratio. So they found that the larger ash borers had significantly greater vibrations in terms of amplitude and were associated with a more female-skewed sex ratio in the Tetrasticus adults. The larger hosts also were associated with more overall Tetrasticus progeny, so males as well as females, but the effect was not quite statistically significant. And so they found support for their first 2 hypotheses, that large hosts produce more offspring and more female offspring, and vibrations of greater amplitude. but they did not find support for their third hypothesis. There was no correlation between progeny and vibration data. And so how Tetrasticus is assessing host quality is still unclear, but the authors felt that vibrational cues were still the most plausible explanation that we have so far. They thought perhaps drilling the accelerometers may have caused the ash borers to delay their feeding behavior, and this could have skewed results. Perhaps if the ash borers were moving differently at the time they were parasitized than at the time they were recorded, this might have also skewed results. Or perhaps the statistical power of their test was not high enough to detect an effect due to small sample size. And so now we turn over to our second paper, and another important concept in parasitoid ecology. The textbook spends a good deal of time talking about specialization among parasites and parasitoids and how this has allowed their adaptive radiation. And this system is a good example of niche partitioning among the species and how they're dividing up the host resource. So Tetrasticus has a short ovipositor, and this means that it can only lay eggs in trees with bark under 3.2 millimeters thick. Unfortunately, this excludes about 1/4 of the population of ash trees in the U.S. Spatheus galeni, on the other hand, has a longer ovipositor, and so the authors were testing the hypothesis that it can oviposit in trees with much thicker bark than Tetrasticus can, and also that larval feeding would significantly reduce bark thickness as the larvae are taking out a lot of that tissue, and that this would facilitate parasitism. So they raised larvae on ash logs from 3 different size classes with varying bark thickness. They exposed the larvae to parasitites, and then eventually they debarked the logs and counted the larvae that had been parasitized. They also took some bark measurements. They looked at bark thickness, which was the distance from the outer bark to the cambium, and bark thickness over gallery, which is the distance from the outer bark to the top of the larval gallery, which since the larvae are often feeding partially in the phloem. And so their regression line predicted that parasitism would significantly drop off as the bark got thicker. But they also found that where ash logs had larvae feeding on them, those logs were thinner than the logs that did not have larvae feeding on them. And so as a result, the predicted thickness over the galleries was reduced to this range that you see with the red line in the upper right graph, which converged with the area where Spatheus was found to be most capable of attacking, and that's the area to the left of the red line in the lower graph. And so this led to the conclusion that Spatheus can control the ash borer in larger sized trees, filling a niche that Tetrasticus currently cannot. And if you do some calculations on the different sizes of ash trees in the Northeast, Spatheus will be capable of attacking 97.5% of those. And a conservative estimate for its oviposition limit is that it is more than 4 times greater than that of Tetrasticus. Overall, it's important to keep in mind, however, that we did see parasitism drop off as the bark got thicker, and therefore we do need to continue to explore other mortality factors such as woodpeckers. And so some overall conclusions from these papers. We saw with the first that when we have concealed hosts, it's an experimental challenge to confirm or find evidence for cues that parasitoids are using, at least when it comes to larval vibrations. and we need more studies of those vibrations in this system. And the better we understand these factors, the more precise models we can construct to look at both short-term and long-term population change in these species. And from the second paper, we know that Spatheus is a valuable addition to the biocontrol program. And precise knowledge of oviposition limits can help managers in the field if they are coming to a release site with a certain size trees. They will know whether Spatheus can attack hosts on those trees, or whether the trees are too large and the managers need to consider options such as removing trees or applying insecticide. And overall, it's important to keep in mind that the niches of Spatheus and Tetrassicus, while they were somewhat distinct, they did still overlap, and Spatheus was still attacking hosts on thinner bark at the same thicknesses as Tetrassicus. And so we should give careful consideration as this system progresses to circumstances in which one of the species may be driven away from the ash borer host onto potentially other invertebrates that are associated with ash trees. And so these are some issues that I hope to be diving into some more with everyone in the online discussions. If you have any questions, my email is up on the screen, and I look forward to seeing you all in the online space. And thank you for listening.